Agrion. Agrion.
And then we can talk about any further details as we get to Q&A toward the end. And also, Dan Linhart, Senior Policy Associate with PACE Energy and Climate Center.
I'm Andy Bridges. I'm the Director of Institutional Programs at the Connecticut Green Bank.
I'm Peter Flynn. I'm a principal with Bostonia Partners.
Carl Olmsted, I'm the Director of Marketing and Business Development for Finance Solutions.
Jennifer Carney, Executive Partner, Gotham 360.
I'm Rob Kaplan from GER, Project Development.
George Honorable, CIBC, World Markets, Real Estate Finance Group.
Mike Bruce, New York City Housing Authority, Energy Department.
Mike Price, the Association for Energy Affordability.
Martha Sickles, Urbicon.
Erin McNally, Routine Associates, we're a NYSERDA outreach contractor.
Alex Leffman, Attorney with PC.
Mark Rodovin, CEO of North Avenue Research.
Holly Andriuzzi, I'm an originator in Energy Services Group for Bank of America Public Capital Corp. Finance Energy Efficiency Project Management.
Lisa James, Bank of America Public Capital Corp. And Holly Finance Energy Projects Management.
Luke Sarwick, I'm a Senior Associate in the Energy Efficiency Division at ICF International.
David Kane, partner with Village Power.
Eric Hernandez here from Wildland Energy Solutions on behalf of the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation.
Tim Hoffman, Managing Director of Watts Capital, and next to the Metro Director of Municipal.
Phyllis Kessler, I'm of counsel and an energy attorney at Twain Morris.
So we're going to start off, I think, with a little brief introduction. I just asked, so if anybody has a question throughout, let's save that to the end. There's going to be about a 30 to 45-minute period at the end for interactive Q&A. If you have something, a very brief question, maybe you need clarification on something, that's fine. But other than that, I think we'll keep most of the Q&A towards the end. So opening up, I think it would be great if each of the four of you could maybe speak for a couple of minutes generally about financing as a whole. What do you see as the appetite for energy projects in general? Do you see this as necessary most of the time to get them financed? And to what extent, what percentage of projects tend to be financing? How does that come together? And sort of, I mean, this isn't like most municipalities are saying, oh, well, we've got, all this money, great, let's go out and we're financing just one or two projects. I think the commonly held conception is that, no, this is very much of a need to be filled. So let's see if that's in fact a good assumption and speak about that.
Sure. So my role in Connecticut is to help the MUSH market develop energy projects, both renewable and efficiency projects. We're tasked with bringing private capital to the market, but in general, we're trying to just ramp up the activity. I think as projects get deeper, as people get beyond doing just the low-hanging fruit projects, there's a critical need for financing, no question. And the concept of cash neutral financing, where you can combine aggregate measures to create something that's cash flow neutral or positive from day one, is the way to appeal to people to
So not just one project, but tend to be a portfolio of projects together. Okay.
Well, just a little background on Bostonia, just to give you a perspective of sort of how I approach our we approach the market. So we focus on real estate and energy, and on the energy side, where I focus my practice, we've done about $2 billion worth of energy efficiency, distributed generation, renewable energy, and in the MUSH markets, we focus more on P3 structures. So ESPC, utility energy services contract, energy services agreements, commodity services agreements, often including off-balance sheet structures to deliver those projects. And that can be a challenge in the MUSH markets. Certainly we haven't talked about some of the projects we've been involved with, but it's not always a P3 structure is not always the answer.
Talk about what a P3 structure is.
Public-private partnership. Okay. So it may involve third-party ownership of an energy asset and sales of commodities or services through an energy services agreement. And those don't work everywhere, right? But it's something that municipalities and other participants in the MUSH market ought to be considering, and particularly in times of these realm of capital budget constraints, bonding, capacity issues. So those traditional methods of municipal leases, geo bond issuances, aren't always available. So these P3 structures are something that we're advocating, and others are advocating to just be another foot.
I see them as an enabling mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. Another way to deliver projects, deliver savings, rather than oftentimes you're waiting for bonding approval. Andy and I were talking about that earlier. And what happens to those savings as you're waiting? And, you know, they're lost. And that's lost revenue, that's lost taxpayer dollars. So this is an approach to sort of deliver those savings earlier and have project delivery quicker and potentially more efficient.
Okay, we'll definitely circle back to that topic. Karen?
Kind Solutions has been in the energy services business for 17 years since we started the company with the advent of deregulation. The energy services works to do all the energy efficiency infrastructure improvements. So one of the primary vehicles for bringing energy efficiency, particularly to the federal market, as well as the muni and the university hospital type markets, is what the ESPC structure, Energy Savings Performance Contract. This is a vehicle that should sell like hotcakes as far as I'm concerned, because it allows the buyer to get a full turnkey capability, where we look at the entire infrastructure of energy and look to do what is necessary in order to maximize the efficiency and upgrade their entire infrastructure to the extent that it's needed. And the benefit is that the savings pay for your financing, and we guarantee it. So I think for the institutions that we're working with, where they don't have access to capital or they don't want to utilize it in their general obligation bonds or their capital in this manner, this gives them another way to get these types of projects accomplished. And I think one of the reservations or concerns that customers can have in achieving energy efficiency is, how do I know it's real? Or how can I be so certain that you're going to achieve the savings that you have here on paper? Well, that's a guarantee. So if we do M&V or we do stipulated savings, depending upon the application, and we say if your savings hasn't exceeded or been enough to meet your debt obligation or your financing obligation, then we pay the differential. We currently have contracts with the federal government, the DOD and the DOE, the IDIQ contracts. We've done many school systems and many needs in this type of application, and I think the product that we offer by doing a turnkey application gives them the resources that they need to get the job done right. So from an engineering perspective, they're getting what they need, and from a financing perspective, they're getting what they need. So kind of a win-win for all the audiences that the customer has.
And just as a point of clarification, you mentioned the project and you called it energy efficiency. My sense is that it's not necessarily just that. It could be distributed generation or some other types of things. So this is an all-encompassing term.
Energy related. I mean, we've done pools.
What Rev is calling distributed energy resources.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Typically, though, they're delivered as savings.
Oh, yes, no, I agree. So let's talk about, we're not restricting ourselves just to weatherization and, CFLs. This is, that's the only thing for efficiency, but just, this is a broader thing. This could be new equipment installation. This could be a lot of other things.
So Gotham 360 is a full-service energy management consulting firm. The majority of our clientele are very large, not-for-profits, so universities, colleges, a lot of healthcare, and kind of across all of our clients, we're seeing a lot of pressure from above to achieve two things. One is operational cost savings, the other is resiliency. So these two things together kind of really lead to a lot of development of energy efficiency, CHP, distributed generation, and even more progressive renewable energy projects, especially in the higher ed market, and now some interest in energy storage. It bolsters resiliency and potentially also offers cost savings. And we're seeing a lot of the large institutions who 3 years ago would have never considered a third-party financial model are now all asking for it. So I think that, like right now, everything is on the table.
So actually, let's talk a little bit more about that, because a few people brought it up. So off-balance sheet financing, there seems to be a growing appetite for that. What are the barriers to that strictly from a deal breaker perspective, either because the accounting rules don't allow for it, local municipalities? What, if any, are the hard deal breakers where they can't do it? And then those aside, what are the other barriers that maybe can be overcome through education or outreach?
One is
we'll go
a
first.
complete lack of understanding and lack of agreement in the accounting community.
Okay. So there's no consensus with
There's
that
no
on this?
consensus. So our starting point with any client when that comes up as a topic is take that off the table. And it's great.
Really, out of the gate, they're saying don't?
Yeah. That is off the table. That cannot be a criteria for success or failure. We have to move forward whether or not this happens because there's so much uncertainty with it that you can't risk the entire project just hinging on that one element.
Do you feel that's because they're getting pressured from people maybe higher up the chain of command in government to say, look, no, we don't want to go out on a limb with this? Or what other reason might you think they
Nobody
might be
wants to
having?
take the risk.
Okay. And that's whether it be municipality, nonprofit,
Yeah.
what have you?
Right.
Okay. So one of the barriers is, to your point, lack of consensus in the accounting community.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I guess, I would prefer to let my financial concierge speak to this.
That's okay.
But, the leasing is fine because it's actually a great opportunity because it doesn't impact their, debt and their ratings by the rating agencies. So that.
Yeah, that's definitely the pro side.
A motivational thing
Yeah.
on the part of the munis that they can still continue to do more projects with the funds that they have without influencing their rating.
Yeah, I would say, I think the accounting treatment is a concern. I don't know that it's a no-go type situation. I think there are folks who are still looking at these type of structures.
But the fact that it's even a concern to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to overcome it. We're working with private sector clients as well who are concerned about that. And ultimately, we can structure things to deliver, off balance sheet stuff, but it's their internal accountants and auditors are going to make that decision. So we've got to really work in partnership and start that process at the beginning before you get too far down. Don't deliver, don't negotiate all the documents and then go to the, to the CFO and say, let's just pass off the balance sheet. We've probably all been there, right? So you've got to bring it. One of the pieces of advice is start that process early. I think one of the other roadblocks to these types of structures is everyone says, well, they're just more expensive, right? I can issue a GO bond, I can do municipal lease, tax exempt financing, and this public-private partnership, which utilizes taxable financing, it's more expensive. End of discussion. I think that sort of is a disservice a bit to this, right? It's not always.
So you're saying there's a misconception before they've really run the numbers?
Right.
Okay.
And part of that is you're looking at, your financing coupons. So we're going to finance something up front, and a tax exempt coupon versus a tax coupon is more expensive. But that doesn't sort of look at the full life cycle costs of the project, things like maintenance and deferred maintenance. And I were talking about some of the structures in Connecticut where all these governments are under a lot of stress in terms of budgets and capital budgets, maintenance of buildings, maintenance of facilities is always something that goes first. So a lot of these structures are ways to deliver. You wrap the project into a services type agreement, whether that's a commodity services agreement or an energy services agreement. So not only are they building and delivering the asset, whether it's cogen, CHP, what have you, but they're also responsible for, can be responsible for the operation and maintenance of that facility. So there's value over the full life cycle that doesn't often get analyzed when we're just looking at components.
But too often we're missing the total cost of ownership in the picture.
I guess I agree with what's been said and add to it that I think people have difficulty conceptualizing the ESA model over a comprehensive project. It's one thing to look at a PPA for a fuel cell or solar panel that, should I choose to non-appropriate execute,
Right.
they can just take it away on a
Here's
truck.
this easy
Do I really
distribution
want
thing,
someone
yeah.
else to own the windows in my building, the installation? What are the ramifications of that? And I think that gets to some of the confusion around the accounting, but where we've looked at this for state agencies in Connecticut, who is very reluctant to grant a security interest in anything the state owns, and this wouldn't be doing that. In fact, they'd be owned by someone else, and that's even scarier.
Yeah.
So part of it gets to education, but the reality is this equipment is core functioning to the building. This isn't stuff that can be hauled away.
They're not going to show up with a flatbed truck.
Hopefully.
And haul away oil.
Well, you hope not.
Yeah, so it's- and so what I heard was also that much as the USGDC would have us when you're doing a rebuilding, you get the conditioning agent in the beginning, say to help you with that whole decision. So it sounds like then the auditors should be involved from the very beginning as well. Look, is this an acceptable thing so that you're not getting too far down the path and suddenly you get thwarted at the vote when you try to sign the agreement. And one of you also mentioned credit rating agencies, or rather credit rating. Is that an issue as well, where perhaps they need to talk to Moody's, S&P, et cetera, whoever it is, in the case of a municipality, say? Is there that openness from the credit rating agencies to give this pre-approval saying, no, this will not negatively affect you if you go this financing route? Does anybody have any experience with that?
I don't know that they would prevent you from doing it, but it's critical to understand that the credit rating of the host that's benefiting from the transaction is, while it might be considered up credit in terms of accounting, their credit is important because you need to know that they are going to pay their electric bill should those savings materialize, or their megawatt bill, or however you want to characterize it. So the credit is ultimately important as well and on the line.
So, I mean, do we feel like is that also an avenue of exploration to look at? To, if the fear is, oh, well, our credit rating will be negatively impacted, well, perhaps you can get around that at the beginning by getting some sort of letter of pre-approval or some other sort of bang from the credit rating agency that's ultimately going to be responsible for that.
Yeah, you need to do that up front.
So then if somebody, let's say, wanted to go to a municipality to provide financing, that might be a good thing for them to have their own I think there's something to talk to.
I see it less of an issue with the municipalities than with some of the institutional customers, hospitals, private colleges, that can be much more, the credit ratings can be much riskier than the typically municipalities or state agencies. It seems to be bigger issues.
Yeah, we're sort of talking about, I think, we're sort of conflating a couple things a little bit. So
Sure.
there's, I think you're sort of getting at how do these structures potentially impact the credit rating of the municipality.
Yeah.
And what we look at oftentimes, so that's an important question, particularly for the municipality or the entity that's eligible for the gate. The other side of the credit picture is the credit of the entity you're going to engage in your contract.
That's true, yeah.
So
Counterparty,
and that's, from a financing perspective, we're looking at the credit of the counterparties on the contracts that we're going to finance. So we like to work with a Con Ed and a hospital that has a good credit rating. So that's going to drive the cost of your financing, going to drive, in some cases, just your ability to finance at all.
Well, I think to Kara's point, I think the guarantee is only as good as to a certain extent, the size of the company behind it that can back that up. Yeah. So then let's talk specifically about some of the financing mechanisms that we tend to come across them. So we've already mentioned energy performance contracting. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Any specific thoughts about that? And what helps to make those deals come together? What are their barriers? Where do they work? Where do they not work?
Sure. We see a huge potential for performance contracting in Connecticut. We have the state has not heavily invested in upgrading its buildings in decades, and we think confidently we can point to $800 million of energy waste over the next 15 years that we could reinvest in these buildings. So we're a strong believer in doing it and working hard to ramp it up.
If all the financiers hear that?
We've already
800
told
million?
you.
Okay.
They know.
Okay. Not that you were keeping it a secret.
Well, I think our big challenge is we haven't done it before. It's getting people to do things for the first time, which is just toxic bureaucracy. So any bureaucracy. So that's kind of where we are. Joking, we call it our lead by example program, but 30 other states of the federal government have been doing it for decades. So that might be a mischaracterization, but some
Follow
of
by example.
it seems, some of the other structures that we've explored are Connecticut has a strong commercial PACE program, off to a great start, has some applicability. We are finding some institutional customers that are structurally prohibited from using it because they have outstanding bond covenants with some of the state financing.
Yeah, we'll circle back to PACE.
But we're focused on performance contracting.
And I think the performance contracting, ESPC, it's a well-worn path. The federal government has done billions of dollars of this work. They've delivered, we financed, I think, the largest ESPC in the federal space, which is $208 million project that delivered a microgrid at a federal food and drug administration facility. So you can really do deep, delivery to your point earlier of
Can you
not
talk about
just
some of the aspects of that?
Sure.
So was it just capital spending? Was there also a maintenance and operations perspective?
There
How
is,
did all that come together?
and this is not every project is gonna deliver the savings to deliver you a microgrid, you know, get that on the table.
That's the rarest of the rare.
This was
Yes.
a
So, yeah.
unique example, but it's about a 3.2 million square foot campus with drug administration. They've got critical lab work that needs 24/7, 365 power, surety, and reliability. You know, if they lose it, the cost of losing these experiments are, you know, hard to calculate. So they really, it's 55 megawatts of power on site, a dual distribution loop, participating in automated demand response, thermal storage. It was really, and they delivered a lot of that through value engineering. And it's really a great example of an operational microgrid that can operate, you know, in tandem with the grid when it's functioning. And actually, one 18-month period operated in Island Grove 47 times. So it really showed its value, and is really being looked at by both other federal agencies, particularly DOD, who's very interested in microgrids, and Connecticut's looking at a lot of microgrids right now. As sort of an example of how you deliver these projects.
So for all of the ESPC contracts, we look at the O&M savings as well as the direct energy efficiency, lower utilization by the equipment that we've installed. In addition, we'll look at any demand response participation, and we'll design relative to demand response opportunities as well as peak shaving opportunities, because by looking at the whole infrastructure of the project, you can see how you can impact the commodity supply contracts as well through controlling alternate storage equipment or backup generation equipment, in addition to the normal controls of, you know, the traditional energy infrastructure. So it allows you, these additional cash flows can allow you to increase and enhance the size of, not just the size of the project, but the value of the project. And the smart grid applications are very interesting because in essence you're creating a parallel energy infrastructure, and you can see that as you move forward, you're going to want more parallel infrastructure from a security point of view, particularly as it relates to anything related to government. And so the ability to finance that in an effective way that makes sense for the end user is something that's very compelling. In addition, we look at the ESPC market as, you know, it's just an overwhelming opportunity. The federal government has more goals for achieving, you know, reduced carbon and increased inefficiency with mandates and things like that. Obama came out with something new a couple of weeks ago that's, you know, the bus can't drive any faster than it's going, and that's wonderful for this line of business. But it's also good for the end user to upgrade and have better equipment in their facilities. I mean, you know, we've kind of separated that these are nice things to have in your schools, in your federal buildings. You want them functioning and working for the constituents or the end-use customer that you're serving. So it's not just an analytical project we have going on here. You have people utilizing these infrastructures and these resources, and they should be maintained. I mean, these are all our assets up there.
Yeah.
An asset, so let's maintain them. These are our children that go to these schools and use these services. So this provides them the right vehicle to do it.
In the private sector, institutional world, we're seeing a lot of consolidation among healthcare. Smaller hospitals falling off, larger hospitals becoming larger. A lot of expansion in higher education. Columbia University is building a new campus, basically doubling in size. They were already huge. And when you have institutions this large, you have these bureaucratic layers and these silos of people. I think all would kind of generally agree that the energy efficiency savings performance contract concept is a good one and one worth exploring. But you come to sort of a communication breakdown in that you have the engineering and facilities group who fully understand the project but don't understand the financing. And you have the financial group who completely understands the financing but has no idea what this project is, how it works, what it does. And these people, many times they've never met. And they've both been working for the same institution for 15 years. And
That's in this floor and I'm on this floor.
Yeah, and they don't speak the same language at all.
Yeah.
And
How do you overcome that?
well, one of the things that we do is we act as a translator for both groups, but we don't always have that layer. And this is how, I think just a lack of communication or ability to speak to both is how a lot of these projects just completely fall through the cracks. I
So,
think if there was more technical expertise inside the banking and the financial partners, a lot of this could potentially be overcome.
And I meant to say this before, sorry. If we come to you and you'd rather wait on this, so you don't have to answer every question, so feel free to move on. I'll try to keep it balanced.
Well, and I think you're exactly right, although I was a breath of fresh air. I was at a meeting with a college in New England, talked about the central plant, and at the meeting was the CFO and the facilities manager. So sometimes it
So they knew
happens.
each other.
Yeah, they knew each
That's
other.
great.
They were both very well versed in each other's business, so it was kind of a nice refreshing too. Maybe you guys represent, I don't know.
Some college advanced. Yes. So actually, and I think you bring up a good point, which, and we hear this anecdote a lot, especially in the healthcare sector. Wait, if I had $10 million to spend, you go to head of hospital, they're going to want to put in a new radiology lab on your surgical wing. They don't care about CHP. But it has value, and I think everybody in this room knows that. But when you talk about some of these aspects of adding a resiliency factor, how do you make that as the value proposition? And even more than that, are there specific models that you use, specific subject matter information or expertise that you draw on to help make that case, and try to put a dollar figure on it, because inevitably that's got to be one of the cost or cost mitigation factors on the ledger when costing out this project. Yes, it costs a little more now, but okay, look, the next hurricane that rolls through, you're going to be online. There's a value to that. So thoughts on how you quantify that and make that case?
Sure. Well, Connecticut's approach has been to offer incentives, financial incentives to make the case too, and they're specifically targeted at offsetting the cost of the infrastructure needed to pilot the facility. So not the generation itself, and so what we think that can stand on its own, and the general project can stand on its own. But that's how they put the value on what's perceived as the added cost, and that's what our experiment has been, environmental protection. That's what it is.
Is that because you saw construction happening without that ability?
It's viewed as, I think, the biggest weight on the project, if you will. It's necessary to implement, but the financial models for the cogeneration fees, generation fees, financial models for all the rest of it kind of stand on their own.
Okay.
It's that piece that just seems like an added, an extra. So that's where the state's zeroed in on, and that's where we can go in and help people. But the market itself should be able to justify the cost of the rest of it.
Yeah, the challenge is how you monetize that. There is a value there, and everyone agrees with it. In Connecticut's approach, which we're looking at a microgrid project there, and it's we're looking at providing the debt because it's an ESA structure. There's a deep grant being layered in. There's the Green Bank is participating, and we've got the debt, and it's a nice combination of public and private capital and participation. But it's a good example is in the federal government, the Department of Defense. They're very bullish on energy security. That's a big buzzword, and resiliency. But there is
I don't know that we could translate any of the Department of Defense's priorities into the sectors that we're talking about here.
But you can actually, and the reason is they want energy security, but there's no way to pay for it. They don't value it. You can't monetize it. So similarly, in some of these other, Bridgeport, Connecticut, once Superstorm Sandy comes through, again, they want to be up and running, have the police station open, have support facilities.
Exactly.
And that's
So
the
for
same.
critical services, how do you?
That's right. So it's a critical service for DMV, it's a critical service for Bridgeport. The challenge is it's not valued contractually, so it's hard to monetize from a financing perspective.
Right.
And the answer is to be able to value it. And that's a question for the state, the Department of Defense, whoever's involved that sees value. It's an ongoing struggle. I'm not sure I have the answer. Right. But certainly you can put a value on, losses caused by grid outages, productivity, whether it's damage to facilities, whether it's your
So let's talk about those kinds of specifics.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples? Where were you? Where was anybody? If anybody has examples of this, give some tangible. We did this. We ran this model. We said this is going to cost them X thousand dollars per day of downtime. Therefore, with this sort of model, here's this. I mean, whether that was sort of an insurance underwriter that maybe got into the picture to help monetize that, or how has anybody worked on a project where we can talk about how that came together? And if not, that's okay. I realize it's a fairly new thing, but.
I don't know.
See, I mean, I think we can all agree that that's a necessity, but it's still, this seems to be one of the toughest things.
And I think part of it is you need to know your audience, and when you're selling this type of a project to municipality or any one of these markets, you're selling to multiple types of audiences. You have your effective CEO, you have your accounting and financial people, you have your engineering people. So there's all a series of people who have different goals. And to the extent that you have the conversation relative to that person's goals, then you have a better opportunity to make the whole project go together. So a lot of the goals that you're talking about, whether it's resiliency or sustainability, relate to what I would say is the CEO goals, because they see it as, this is my mission to provide this type of a service, end service. So they may not see efficiency as their primary goal, but they see serving their constituents as their primary goal. So how do I make that happen? And in this type of a project, you can make that happen. Resiliency, in light of Superstorm Sandy, is very important, as are the sustainability goals for many of these organizations and many of the people that they serve. So in various communities. So I think it's the various conversations that you have are all very compelling to the different audiences that you have. So I mean, that's how I look at the different markets.
And I think it's certainly in the municipal sector, like to the emergency services sector, you can say, well, this is a life safety issue if we go down. So right there, that's the big bullet on the PowerPoint slide of why you want to do this. Yes, it's 1 cent more per kilowatt hour, but hey, you're going to be online next year.
And similarly for healthcare. So
Oh, yeah.
monetizing an outage there's an entire department inside the hospital that does nothing but calculate what that risk is and what it's worth and what the value is. So I think that distributed generation CHP is like built in for healthcare. And I think Sandy was a real game changer in terms of what is possible.
And so we talked about having the CFO in the same room with the facilities manager, so maybe it's that yet a third person.
And the risk,
in room.
the
The risk manager.
Yeah.
So they can help, help quantify that. Okay. So earlier on we mentioned, so back to financing mechanisms, we mentioned PACE, property assessed clean energy. So for those of you that don't know, this is basically where you can take out a loan to do energy efficiency improvements, very similar to an energy performance contract in this way, whereas that the savings on the energy can pay the debt service on the loan. The difference is that you pay it through a payment on your property taxes, basically through your municipality, usually as a senior lien. And so that it has the advantage of following the property, not the person. So whether that be a homeowner that decides to put rooftop solar or a larger commercial facility that puts the CHP, if they sell that property, it moves with them. So some states have it, some don't. And let's talk about that, if anybody has experience with that, thoughts on what role that may have to play. In the municipality section, perhaps not as much because they don't pay property taxes. So that's probably a non-starter from the beginning. But let's say outside the municipal area, what roles do you see that playing or could be playing over the next few years?
Well, we see a huge opportunity for it in Connecticut, and nonprofits typically don't pay property taxes either, but they can get a tax ID and can participate in PACE. They can receive a property tax bill, they can have zero taxes of X for their C-based reimbursement. Municipalities would be prohibited from doing it because they use the program, so it's sort of a nuance. But
Well,
anyway,
conflict of interest aside,
yeah,
maybe
conflict
you have
of
revenue
interest.
stream.
Right. So, but no, it's a very advantageous program. The banks like it because people are very likely to pay their property taxes and have a long history of paying them, so it gives them some security that that's coming. Ultimately, it does come down to the credit of the customer, that they're perceived as capable of taking on this loan. It should reduce their overall cost. It should be cash neutral from day one, but that's a factor, so there's strong underwriting criteria. It is a senior lien, so there's the complication of getting a mortgage under consent, where there's a mortgage on the property.
FHFA has said for the last few years, this is a non-starter.
For the residential market,
Yeah, so
they have. The commercial market, we found lots of banks that have done it. Our program is 2 years old. It's ramped up very quickly to doing over $50 million a year at this point and growing fast. So some customers in the MUSH market we're finding are prohibited from using it because they have outstanding bonds from the education finance, hospital education exactly. CPACE isn't applicable to that, but many hospitals, lots of commercial and industrial properties are thrilled with it.
Anybody have anything else?
I think it depends on your, how you flip your portfolio. If you're gonna flip it often, you don't want anything coming between you and that mortgage lender.
Just one other extra thing to deal with in
Yeah,
the sale
I think-
process. Okay. So in
I
high
think
turnover
it
areas.
presents a challenge, but if you have like industrial customers that own the facilities, I think it's a perfect opportunity for them, or a commercial customer that the expectation is they'll own these facilities for a very long period of time. We have a number of large portfolios in the city that, will not engage anything related to that.
Anything else that you want?
I was just going to add that I think one of the benefits that comes from a well-administered CPACE program is a third-party review, which gives the host customer an extra set of eyes, maybe beyond their own engineer or the vendor that's selling them the efficiency service or renewable service. We fund a third-party engineering review process, which both standardizes the presentation of the information, it's helpful to the financial community, but also gives the customer that extra level, extra set of eyes on the project. It gives them the confidence to move forward. In a lot of cases, really what's going forward.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point in that, to a certain extent, I think that infrastructure needs to be in place. I mean, we've seen, I think it's over 30 states have passed PACE-enabling legislation, and yet it's only really gotten off the ground in a few states, California, Connecticut, New York. And I think the argument could be made that one of the reasons that's successful is because the state has engaged to create this engineering infrastructure, this review infrastructure, this objectivity and standardization around it, so that people can walk in, that a lender can come in and provide financing, whether it be before the fact or after the fact. I think Connecticut securitized post facto.
Yes,
Yeah.
we did. We kind of set up a warehouse to finance and take the construction risk, if you will, and then securitize afterwards. We did that. We were in the ideal test. We were a very small state. We got 150 towns, and it was easier than it would be in a much larger state to implement a statewide program. We're about the size of Texas. Somebody's ranch. We were uniquely positioned, I think, to be a good president.
And I think it raises the good opportunity as well for the financiers, saying, okay, well, look, here's this pre-vetted pool of debt that we can then buy en masse.
Right.
An X sort of risk profile. So even if a municipality or state government has to put up X $million, it's not this continually growing amount.
That's right.
They hit a critical mass, securitize, move out, backfill with that money, and then continue on. So, and I think, again, with the sort of senior lead status of that, then as debts go, this is sort of, I think, fairly low risk because the state has very good property tax laws. If you don't pay them, they take your land.
Yeah, exactly.
And so often that will take that precedence over many other things.
And I think as the M&B data comes into these projects, the oldest one is 2 years old at this point, but as we're able to really demonstrate that these are working, they typically don't come with the guarantees of a performance contract, but there still is a metering and verification process. It'll only grow from there. That'll give you.
Well, I think having the state's participation can be a huge benefit on the financing side. We've been involved in a program in Pennsylvania where they basically Treasury funded home energy loan program, and they sort of hit their cap as to where they were. So we worked with them in a secondary market transaction to sort of roll some of that off and create, as you pointed out, sort of room under the cap to sort of recycle the funding. So the state, not every state again can do that, but if the state can find a way to participate and sort of streamline the process, take some of the risk out of it, and then sort of go to the capital markets or your financing partners and see sort of free up some more room in the program.
If you had to offer any advice to people looking to make this happen, whether they're a municipality looking to engage in this, university, et cetera, or a lender who's trying to make this pitch, what advice would you give? Where are the typical roadblocks, hurdles, why do deals fall apart or not get off the ground? Other than some of the stuff that we've already talked about. Anything else, any other words of wisdom that you could offer?
I think the best words that we have talked about is bring the decision makers together at the beginning. Meeting, get them to see CFO, CEO, as well as the facilities guys excited at the same time. It's really critical for moving the projects that any one of them can, stop it. And so we can
And I would add to that, I think we cover, I think every project needs public sector champion. So unless you've got someone sort of invested in the project, invested in the program, that's going to drive it, these projects and programs can die 1,000 deaths along the way. And unless you've got buy-in and someone who's committed to it, it's going to be a real challenge, to an already challenging process.
And would you make the argument that that person probably needs to be salaried by someone or another? I think a lot of times in the municipality sector, we see it being very small. And so inevitably, certain people are filling roles that are on a volunteer basis. But I've seen examples where municipalities, when this person has to move on because of whatever happens in their life or they themselves move, the whole initiative falls apart because they weren't an employee or anything that was sort of keeping it grounded.
Yeah, a good example of a project, we've all been in projects that didn't come to fruition, but this was one, and it was a good lesson a few years back. We were working with the county to do a landfill gas to energy project, and we were putting the financing together. The county commissioners voted unanimously to do the project. No one really covered the folks who actually ran the landfill, and they were sort of agnostic at best about the whole thing. I'm not naming any names, of course, but all the bases weren't touched. There was no champion at the landfill with the staff over there, and guess what happened? The project never happened. And so that was a good consultation, buy-in. Someone really drive the county commissioners voted on it, and then they dispersed, and then folks were left to sort of drive the project. But unless you've got that team put together and someone who's vested in its success on the public side, these projects go.
I guess I would say from where we sit, it's working with the ESCOs or the people in the industry who provide the energy services behind it, so that the financing people need to reach out to them to say, this is what we do, how do you integrate me into your conversation with the customer? Because we've got the whole bundle of people that we're working with to try and move the project forward. The financing arm is a key component of what the offer is all about. So rather than going direct to the town and determining, I guess, if they have a project, the ESCOs will already have done, the RFP work, or they will have done the initial assessment on the end-use customer to say, yes, I have an opportunity, and then bring the financing along with them. So it's another path to building relationships to get you to the end goal that you're trying to achieve, which is to lend money.
There's just, there's even just in the conversation here, you can see there are so many moving parts, and there is so much coordination required to keep all the moving parts kind of in sync together, because any one of them can go off and throw the entire project, over on its side. Coordination, communication, and transparency.
I'd offer my own advice in there as well, is that if possible, create an online platform for collaboration. Information requests, I think, are one of the key early components. And how many emails get lost? Or, boy, do you have this version of it done? What about the new version? Well, no, I have the new version. And did this person send this? And you've got 3 or 4 different stakeholders, which is 3 or 4 different IT domains. And if you don't have that ability for common collaboration of information and documents, I think that is a time suck.
Well, there's a
on the
reason
whole
these
process.
projects take 18 months to close or plus. It's an enormous amount of work. And for them then not to go forward to fail because you've missed a component.
Or you just did a irritation
It
back.
really hurts.
I mean, I think anybody who's ever gone through the process of getting a mortgage for their house can probably sympathize with the concept of having to do document management. So imagine that compounded 10 times. And that's the sort of burden that you're looking at. So, okay, I think we'll move on to Q&A.
It would really be helpful if you could concretize a couple of examples in the MUSH market, because it's MUSH, but there's different kinds of buildings, different kinds of owners. To hear numbers is useful. What are we talking about in terms of size of financing, and how does the factor of energy savings come to play? What are you looking for? Return on investment, how long, that kind of stuff. I mean, what you're talking about is interesting in a
Yeah.
general sense, but
Yeah.
for somebody that is trying to move into this market, I need to hear numbers about what we're talking
Well,
about.
let's try to get one from each industry.
Yeah.
So which one did you want to cover your example?
Most of it's municipalities.
Okay,
so it's
great.
Like
Start with
that.
municipal.
And, I did ask the sales group last night, so give me the average size project. Well, with dealing with the feds, they can be very large, but it came down to some projects for the smaller towns and communities can be like $1.5 million, $2 million. On average, I would say across the bundle of, say, the muni market and the school market, I'd say $5 to $15 million, depending upon the town. I mean,
Is that at
we've got-
100% financing?
We've done a municipality out on Long Island for their school system, and that was ranged in the $10 million range. So it can be as low as $1.5 million, and of course, some of these projects, like you say, can be hundreds of millions of dollars as well. But I think when you look at a school district, or if you look at a small town, they have a handful of buildings, 5 to 10, something like that. So the numbers aren't going to be, extravagant. And I think some of that, from a lender's point of view, they want volume. It's harder to finance the smaller projects, at least that's our sense of it, and you may chime right in. But, financing the smaller ones are almost more challenging than financing the mega ones.
Because of transaction costs.
Well, exactly. I can do just as much work to do $1.5 million or to do $50 million. It's like energy services. I'd rather you brought me the $50 million project than not the $1.5 million. Well, I'm sorry, but today I have $1.5 million.
And the sophistication also of the smaller municipality also maybe more work than with the larger municipality.
They maybe don't have as deep a bench of financially
Correct.
educated people to help move the deal through.
Correct.
So going back to that school district, what were you going to do for that $10 million?
It's usually all the HVAC work,
Mhm.
all the lighting work on the facilities. A lot of the schools today all have air conditioning. It can be backup generation depending upon, their interest in where they're located. It can be motors. It can be, some of them want solar at this point, and we can incorporate the solar opportunities. We do PPAs for solar as well.
Is that separate from the ESCO, so the EPC that you do?
It is.
Incorporated in? Okay.
It's separate, but I could imagine that we can incorporate the cash flow savings, because I'd really like to see the commodity savings. And this is, again, the conversation with the end use customer, because once you're able to change the curve on how the energy is utilized as a result of the infrastructure that you've now installed, and you've given them diversity in how they, heat a building or cool a building through alternate energy sources, whether it's the generation or it's storage or something like that, that creates a cash flow.
What did you project as a savings of that $10 million?
Well, you figure if I'm doing $10 million and I'm paying it over, and I guess one of your other questions was the time frame. A lot of the munis, thankfully, can go out to 15, 20, 25 years. You're not worried they're going anywhere generally. And you feel that they always have the power of the purse on their side. So, it's going to be, $1 million a year for a $10 million project for 10 years plus the interest, so maybe you have a 15-year deal. But I think that's one of the advantages of working with this type of market is that they can sign up for 15 years. We were having a conversation about the commercial market and the ability to finance as well as their perspective. If it isn't a 2-year payback, forget it. I'm not interested. Whereas the munis take a much longer view of the world, as I'm sure that the hospitals and the universities do, because they don't feel like that they need to flip the buildings anytime too soon or that they're going away. Did I address all your questions?
Thank you very much.
I have materials with me. My backpack's very heavy, so, if you needed case studies and things like that.
Oh,
certainly
interest
ask
rate.
me. Interest rate, it would be the going interest rates from the financiers, because we do work with third-party financiers. Kind of Solutions only currently finances the PPAs on solar. So it's going to be the going rate of what these institutions, the credit rating of the muni, et cetera. all
And
those
is
things.
the interest rate another variable the size of the deal, i.e. are you likely to get more attractive financing terms when you bring a larger deal to the table?
Yes, I think you are. You're going to realize some efficiencies in that process. But really, I think you've got to find financing partners. You don't have to cherry your $1 million project. That don't, you know, there are some out there who only want to, talk to me if you bring me a $50 million project. You know, you need someone, you need to partner with someone who's going to understand your business, understand what you're doing, finance your $1 million projects as well as your $200 million projects.
I have a friend from Sotheby's used to say, it's like sometimes you have to auction off the silver to get to the Monet, and then it's a good sale.
So it's a nice problem to have.
Yeah, exactly. So, Jennifer, do you have any projects from maybe in the healthcare sector?
So there's a tremendous amount of interesting combined heat and power systems in healthcare for both the cost savings aspect and resiliency. And so we've seen, 2 megawatt projects priced at about, $8 million with roughly a 5 to 7 year payback, up to, a 12 megawatt project at over $100 million because it also includes, backup boiler plant, primary electric system, and a new building to go with it. So it really, they run the gamut. There can be, I would say an $8 million cogen is on the low side, and then they can go well over $100 million, depending on size.
What's the largest you've done?
112 million.
Is that for an aggregate of hospitals? Or?
No, it was for one hospital.
One of the other things that on the facility for the BMS systems, so the ability to control, because that's really where you want to be. You're able then to optimize your energy consumption, is the ability to control the equipment, participate in demand response markets, and flatten your load curve. So and reduce your utility demand charges. So the ability to monitor and see real time how your equipment is performing and how you're performing relative to your need is also something that's then built into these systems. So that's the future of energy, and how to integrate the supply side of the equation with the demand side of the equation is information and control. So I can respond to what's going on at the NISO. How's my pricing going, and then how do I choose to take action as a result of that? I either can say, yes, I want to take action and reduce my costs, or I want to participate in demand response, or no, I don't. And it gives the customer a lot more control and ability to manage their energy resources. And that's what it is. It's a resource. It's not just equipment anymore. It's not just, I need this or I need that. It's looking at the whole portfolio that you need to be paying attention to really get the most value out of it.
Yeah, I just was going to touch on two scale projects in Connecticut. So for our CPACE projects, the CPACE, the commercial property assessment energy projects, the average size is about $750,000. They range from about 200,000 up to 3 million. About a third of them are strictly energy efficiency measures that are mentioned. A third are renewable energy, and a third are both. So that's kind of how they break down. On the state side, from a larger project, we've got a really fascinating case study. I'm happy to share it with people here at a campus called the Connecticut Valley Hospital. It's the state's mental health hospital. It's over 150 years old, started to be built.
So not going anywhere.
1.5 million square feet. Yeah, no, it's providing critical services, patient services, up through almost prison level services. And it's a critical piece of our infrastructure. We are doing an ESCO ESPC project there. It's about $32 million. It's got just under an 11-year payback. That's assuming a 3% interest rate. Over the 25-year expected lifetime of the equipment, it's going to throw off $65 million in cash beyond the $32 million it saves. It's going to save 60% on the utility bills at this campus. We're doing everything from fuel switching, where they're using oil now, to natural gas, replacing 2.5 miles of steam pipe distribution system. The steam system is losing 30,000 gallons a day of boiler water. That's about the size of a good-sized residential swimming pool.
Yeah.
Just heated, treated, boiled, and put in the ground. And I'm not saying this critically of the people who work there. This is an old campus. These are common issues at any old campus. Our University of Connecticut is also doing it. They have an equal level of steam distribution leaks, even though above ground their buildings look a lot better than Connecticut Valley Hospital. So it's rampant at these old facilities. So some of the other measures with windows, lighting, air handler units, cogeneration, insulation, a small PV system, water conservation measures, an EMS, energy management system, upgrades to their pool. It's the gamut.
And I think there's something, a good point to be made in that, even though you can't necessarily monetize it, if you do, for example, like a design, build, own, operate, and manage, I think with that perhaps comes the attention to operations to maybe help prevent problems like that from mushrooming in the future, when you have professional facilities managers constantly looking at this, so that when the first leak happens underground, they can actually fix it and prevent those from getting any further down the line, hopefully avoid future situations.
Yeah, we're building in a big maintenance contract as part of this, and, training the facility personnel who have already learned a lot, because this great big facility had one gas meter and one electric meter at the street, not a clue where the energy was going. Also not uncommon, not throwing them under the bus. So, we did a $500,000 sub-metering effort that will be paid back by the project as well. Now they know and can manage because they have the information. So, everything from, a PV system on a car dealership through the C-Phase program to a comprehensive rebuild of a 1.5 million square foot campus. We see as opportunities. They both the cash flow.
How big is the population in this facility?
Of that facility, I think they're about 1,000 staff and somewhat less than that tenants, if you will. Customers. Some are there for life, and
Yes.
some are there for inpatient treatment.
Yeah, Jennifer, quick question about third-party financiers and large CHP. Are you finding that the third parties are actually responsible for the natural gas feeding the CHP, or are the hospitals actually responsible for the natural gas?
In most cases, if you're going to do a third-party financed CHP, the third-party owner is going to take responsibility for the procurement of the gas, but in many cases, they'll do it in a collaborative fashion with the hospital.
I think in some cases it's going to depend on how you set it up. So if you set it up as basically you're selling energy, then the third party is going to pay for the gas because they're selling the electricity. But if you set it up as a lease of equipment, then generally it would be the hospital who's going to pay for the gas. So it really just depends on, on your vehicle.
Oh, I just was going to provide some data in terms of interest rates. In the MUSH market, say for a good credit municipality or a school district, we've been, financing projects in the twos, mid 2% range. Those are for really good, towns and school districts. A little bit higher for the institutional market for hospitals and colleges. They carry a premium to that. We run the New York PACE program. We work on the New York PACE. We're financing our third project next week.
This is energizing.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And the rates on those transactions run between 4% and 6%, let's say. It goes up to a 20-year term. So, 4-ish on the shorter end, 6% on the longer end. So that's kind of it.
And also what I was saying, when talking about the smaller deals versus the larger deals, with the rates be different. It can be based on deal size, but you also have to look at your competition. And sometimes when we're bidding on these $1.5 million or $2 million deals, the rates can be low because the competition is so great. And so sometimes that's really
So a reverse auction.
But so sometimes that's really the driver. Is
Yeah.
really not the size of the project, but maybe could be our competition and what we think our competition is going to bid. Their rate is going to be for that particular transaction. And so we may give a small transaction a really good rate because we would like to win that deal. And we know what our competition is going to be bidding. And so that has a lot to do with it. How many competitors, other lending institutions or financing, going to bid on this transaction and where we've seen them in the past. And that has a huge impact on where we're going to bid.
Yeah, it's a good point. The fact is that there's a lot of capital out there looking for good projects. So things are very competitive. It's a good time to look at these types of projects, and financing is very competitive.
And the rates right now are very low. today I noticed it said your swap rate's even lower. You have to understand that, in the MUSH or in the MUSH market, in the energy performance contracts, like, Energy Kinetic Solutions does with the banks, we've been doing those for years. And we're doing these equipment lease purchase agreements for most of the transactions, and it's a very competitive market, it's very robust. There's a lot of capital available to well-rated municipalities, universities, and schools. So these entities don't have a lot of barriers to getting this particular kind of financing.
Right.
It's out there, and there's a lot of options for them, who the lender's going to be. When the projects start becoming more complicated, there's third-party PPAs, that's where, the banks, play in a different arena. But in the standard MUSH market, ESCOs, we do ESCO projects every day. That's all we, most of what we do. And we work very closely with the ESCOs. We're out there partnering with them all the time, meeting with them, helping them with financing end of these projects so that they can work with the facilities guys, we can work with the treasurers, the CFOs to, talk their language and help the ESCOs to bring that together.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think, if there are barriers to financing in the MUSH market, so it's okay, what are the barriers in the MUSH market? The barriers are poor credit, that's certainly a barrier. But under the traditional approach, we have an energy performance contract, and let's say a lease or a bond issue, I think credit's the barrier. If you start going into the service agreements or PPAs or other, forms of type structures, that's a whole other conversation.
Well, actually, I have a couple of comments, and one is about barriers. I worked with hospitals for many years, and one of the barriers that I saw a lot was at the facilities level, the engineering level. You have people who've been there a long time, very often they're entrenched, and this could be colleges and anywhere else. But what you need to do if you're trying to sell a project is make them look good, because sometimes their concern is that you're making them look bad and they're worried about losing their jobs and you're going to get in your way.
Or perhaps even if they didn't seem to be doing a bad job, are they worried about their own redundancy with this change of equipment?
Right. So and particularly if you bring in outside maintenance and things like that's one area where I think there's a very big issue. And then in terms of starting to value externalities that have not been valued, the recent order in New York, at least in the red case, and what that case is looking to do going forward in New York is going to be to create a market that will then make the value of distributed resources and potentially even energy efficiency. It's going to be able to, I think, at least the goal is to create a value for those resources more generally to the state energy markets that may produce some additional value that we haven't seen up until now. So, I mean, that's a little
where
bit,
they're going,
it's a little bit in the future.
I think it's
We
too
don't
early
have-
to try to put a
Right,
price
we
tag on
don't.
it. Anyway, they can
Right,
affect
but I think
the
that's,
answer, yeah.
I think that within a few years, we're gonna actually
Oh,
see
absolutely,
that.
yeah, that's definitely the goal.
In a way that we haven't seen it up until now, and it's been kind of frustrating, to be honest.
I want to come back to risk broadly. So, talking about EE, we've been talking about everything from CHP to PV, and wondering if we could give some comments on the risk based on experience of those different project elements. So, LED lighting is very low risk, not a big deal. CHP, not so much.
What makes you say that?
The expected performance versus the actual performance is much more variable than lighting. So somebody's taking risk, right? It's not always the lender if they're secured in a somebody's taking risk. And so, maybe it's ESCO, maybe it's ultimately the owner. But when we look at risk and financing, it's the counterparty from everything else, but it's also fundamentally what's happening with the installation. How is it performed? So if we could, and then the second part of that question is storage. So we haven't talked about storage. Is it generation asset? Is it not? Is it part of this? Is it not? Is Connecticut interested in thinking about storage as part of its program? So those two things. How have the assets been performing relative to everybody's assumed expectations, and what do we think about storage?
One thing just to point out, I think you put a bad assumption in there when you say ultimately the risk is on the owner. As we talked about before, some of these contracts are in fact deliberately designed to shift that risk away. So in fact, sometimes it doesn't ultimately sit with the owner, it sits with the ESCO.
Right.
So, all right, so let's
I
talk
would
about
say,
that.
and Karen made this point earlier.
The owner of the owner of the asset.
Well,
Yes, but not the owner of the building, which is.
No, I meant
Okay.
the owner of the asset.
Well, the owner
okay,
of the
so
asset
clear on
may,
that, yes.
doesn't always take the risk either. So if the asset owner, so if you're putting a new boiler in a building and you're doing that through a performance contract, really the ESCO is taking that risk of the ongoing performance.
Even though they don't own it.
Even though they don't own it. They've signed up to take that risk. And so from a financing perspective, working with the ESCOs, we sort of break it down into sort of two pieces of risk, the construction for the installation phase and then the performance phase. And just, we've been financing these projects since 1998, a couple billion, so a lot of track record to look at. I'd say 85% to 95% of your problems with these projects come in the installation phase or the construction phase. The ESCOs are very good at the engineering side, understanding the savings that are being delivered. They very, very rarely, if ever, do we see a failure to deliver guaranteed savings in these projects. Usually if there's some problem, it's in the installation phase, some kind of condition that no one knew about, some asbestos gets discovered, the project gets delayed, all sorts of scenarios you can come up with. But that's really, I think, where a lot of the risk resides. But that risk is borne, for the most part, by the ESCO. They're really taking the risk to deliver this project on time and on budget and to deliver the savings that they've guaranteed. And so that's their risk. And when we partner to provide that financing, we're looking to the ESCO. We're looking for the owner as sort of the payment obligation, so their credit is a piece of this. But the ESCO is also a piece of this, so it's sort of a hybrid credit between the ESCO that's participating, providing their guarantee, and the owner, the facility owner, that's got the obligation to pay if those savings are actually delivered.
I do think that's worth pointing out, we didn't really talk about that before, is that is another value proposition in going to an ESCO, is that not only do you get this guarantee, but then there's the reduction of management overhead needed by whoever that facility owner is. I certainly have less to worry about with these contracts, with facilities maintenance, with equipment maintenance, perhaps even with staffing if I look to be a completely outsourced model. All of that goes away, and so even if you're small enough that maybe it's not a full head count, there's certainly that administrative work, which is, gone away. Now I can concentrate on my core business, whether that be educational, government services, et cetera, delivering that, not worrying about whatever my boiler plant's looking at.
Well, I think the beauty of these is that the municipality or the facility owner drives that process. They decide what risk they're going to take, what risk they're going to hand off, and it lends itself to a well thought out, as you've laid out. What risk am I taking? What risk am I going to hand off? How am I going to staff this? Am I going to look to the ESCO to staff this? And it really provides a really good opportunity to sit back and take a look at how you're going to deliver your services over 25 years or long.
I was just going to jump in. I generally agree with what you're going to say, although there is still a role for a third-party measurement verification process.
I think there has to be.
And most hosts would engage an owner's engineer to kind of represent their interests as the people. It's probably the only time a host does a big project, but they're working with companies that do this thousands of times. So you need more kind of eyes that you can bring to the table, whether that's through technical support that the state program brings, or your own engagement of a trusted engineer, whatever it might be. So you're not hands off on the analysis of the
that's a fair point.
contract or the verification of savings going forward.
So much as you need a financial auditor, so too do you.
That said, I think that the international protocols have sort of been set up for this M&B process to the point where everyone knows how it should be done now, and the projects tend
topic, so we don't have to discuss this if you don't want, but when, let's say, they do choose to outsource and you have then the on-site staff provided by the ESCO, does that tend to align where if you're in a place where they tend to organize labor already, the staff then hired is also willing to organize labor? Is there ever a source of friction because there's this perception that you're moving out of this?
That's tricky. That's tricky business
Yeah.
right there. And I would say it's, absolutely on a case-by-case basis. And in New York City, it's, extremely sensitive. We have seen instances where the ESCO will bring in a management layer, but that the staffing will remain union and will remain the staff of the organization host. And that is probably the most streamlined way to approach it.
I wanted to mention it just because, as we've talked before, some people say, oh, well, a public-private partnership is a non-issue from the get-go without having really looked at the whole situation. And I've heard that argument be made, oh, well, no, look, we are a union shop, we can't do anything else. And this doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you're moving away from. So that's, I think, another thing that's important to point out.
We comply with whatever the customer requires.
So that could be one of the stipulations in the whole arrangement. Look, this has to be the appropriate representation.
And again, these aren't one size fits all. It's really about what the customer wants. They design the contract. They tell you what labor they're going to use, what resources they need, what they like to do. So.
Sometimes their procurement rules,
Sorry?
sometimes the municipalities' procurement rules determine, are already in place, so you have to follow them.
And so then I think that it's important for them to have whatever cost components might be associated with that put in and make sure that that all gets accounted for when looking at the overall financing.
When trying to sell these projects on a kind of first touch basis, are you finding more success talking at the CEO level or working from the kind of facilities up level? Sort of some of this was addressed a little bit earlier. Rev in New York is trying to address some of that and valuing valuing DR and how that will kind of trickle down towards the facilities from the top. But how is it right now? What kind of tips do you offer for
I've never seen a project originate from finance. I've only seen them originate from operations, facilities, engineering. But kind of to an earlier point that was made, it's very important to get finance buy-in and involvement very early and to put together kind of internally a collaborative team.
So first touch is in engineering level.
Is that because maybe you want to do with them first, they can get you the information so you can at least do that initial feasibility study of, look, is this even worth going to phase 2?
Yes, and also to an earlier point, I don't think that everybody in the financial world is even aware that savings are out there.
If you want to go to them with a quantified number.
Absolutely.
I think it's the people who have the responsibility for the facilities. Because the engineering staff is to report to them, so the engineers are a component, but it's the folks who are responsible for the performance of those facilities who are, and a lot of times now there is the sustainability vice presidents. I've seen that title captures all the commodity supply, requirements as well as the infrastructure requirements. So.
Sustainability manager, director of facilities.
Yeah.
Director of engineering.
Mr. Chairman, can I cut you off before?
Oh,
I was just going to add, so we've tried, I agree with starting with facilities and with a group of nursing homes in Connecticut and the Connecticut Technical High School group, about 20 vocational schools. We've had first a meeting with their facilities group, and it almost becomes an airing of grievances meeting, but talk to them about the measures that might be applicable, and they share their war stories of what they're dealing with. And then we invite that group to the meeting with the CFOs, where we present, the idea, we've talked to them, we've identified some of the challenges they're facing in the field. They really like being included up front to be a part of the process and feel like they're a little bit more in control. We think that it's really been effective. And then you've got some real stories to present to the CFOs when you go to them and say, you've got real problems here that need to be solved, and now we can talk about how we can solve them together. It seems to have worked really well in both cases.
We have a question over here, I think. Yeah.
Kara, can I ask, do you ever bring to any of private or municipal the idea that maybe they can save additional funds in the way of green? I mean, it helps count it as well, but do you ever introduce that from the other side of the coin? Instead of them coming to you, you going to them and say, hey, why don't you look at green products? Why don't you try to do sustainable projects? Just for the simple reason, you're going to save yourself a substantial amount of money.
Well, they would be incorporated into the whole audit process. Any type of, whether it's a storage application, whether it's, energy efficiency is considered green.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that instead of them coming to you and say, hey, we're looking at a sustainable project, what do you think? Does Con Ed put out something that says, why don't you look at sustainable projects that can save you, and we'll give you examples, and we'll even show you directions you might want to go.
I just want to make it clear, I'm not Con Ed as a utility. I'm Con Ed Solutions, the unregulated
Okay.
side. So our motivation is to present the whole, gamut of green. Every option that's out there, that's available to them in terms of how to manage their energy infrastructure in conjunction with their portfolio is what we'll put together. So it's a puzzle for everybody based upon what their goals are, what their needs of the organization, and how they want to move forward, what their financing capability is. And then we assess where they want to be on the green spectrum. So for example, many customers are looking at the solar applications. Many look at green supply on their portfolio, and they can buy a piece of it, with National Wind or with, hydro, not hydro.
No, I'm not disputing that. It's just that a lot of, as someone said before, about, well, they might have a facilities manager who says, well, I'm going to lose my job if this is what happens. So they're not going to look at it from that perspective and say, you know what, we can save a ton of money here over the winter span. Just comes to mind the New York Times building. That's been built 15, 20 years ago. If you look at that and say how much energy are they blowing out every single day? Not because it's a whole winter, just in the use of energy. And you went to them and said, hey, you guys maybe would consider looking at this, and this is the portfolio that maybe we can show you.
They've already had a CHP system in their basement.
Yeah.
I've been there, I've seen it. Yeah.
I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
Kara and other, her colleagues at other ESCOs have staff that are out there. It is their job to go sell these types of projects and knock on doors and find.
ESCOs and financiers are not sitting on their hands waiting for people to knock on their door.
Oh,
There's
I know
money
the
to be made here,
escrows
they're out
aren't.
coming.
I know the escrows aren't.
Yeah,
But
the
I'm
utilities.
just stating that they can't be everywhere. And a lot of times they're waiting for projects to be, whether it be RFPs or what have you, to come to them versus the other way around. Instead of saying, hey, let's be creative and let's see what we can show these people that works for them, and how it can work for them. And it won't, not just today or tomorrow, but in 10 years or 20 years, be it a municipality, be it a school, be it a business, be it a highways, all of those.
Well, I think most people in the industry do the push and the pull. I mean, if you can avoid an RFP,
Oh, I
it's a good
I agree to
That
that.
process is very time consuming, so.
In the municipalities,
you're
almost
motivated.
impossible. But
What's that?
I said, in the municipal sector, almost impossible.
It's almost
but,
impossible
yeah.
as part of the process, but from a commercial perspective, that's exactly, we're looking to build a business in the commercial markets as well, and many of them, although, I guess it's both sides, don't go RFP. They,
Nope.
That's
Sorry, go ahead.
okay.
I was going to say, though, I think it's worth pointing out that there is, in some aspects, including New York City, a slight, I don't know if loophole is the right word, but I've seen some city procurement where an ESCO or an ideas comes and say, look, we can deliver you this service at this price. And that city agency can then go out and not say, well, look, I need an RFP. They can say, no, look, we want this service at this price. If anybody can deliver us something better, great. If not, we're going to go with this party that came to us. And so in a way that allows the municipality to go through it faster without having to do, quote, a huge competitive bid, which can often, let's say, have 3 to 6 months to make. So that, and many municipalities have that capability. So that's one avenue of exploration that's worth pursuing sometimes.
RFPs are typically written by the winner.
As a former city employee, I can neither confirm nor
Yeah.
deny.
It certainly doesn't hurt.
I can give you an example though.
go to step C. Well, actually, I want to move on to another question if we have any others before, yeah.
Yeah, so any insight into where we are in bringing the pace to the city, keeping in mind that it doesn't have a regulatory support it needs right now?
Just in my own experience, I think you have to talk to city government about that. I can say that at the state level, it's already set up, and NYSERDA gave seed financing to EIC, Energy Improvement Corporation.
What was the question?
Is paced any closer to New York City? Ultimately, it's, and so correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone wants to chime in here, but since it's the municipality that's going to bill you at the end of the day, they're the ones that need to be on board, so that means city government. The state has authorized it, they've already paid for the back-end infrastructure to support it, and it's very big in Westchester already, a program called Energize New York. How that gets into New York City, I think is really a question for the mayor's office.
So maybe just a function of.
The money is there,
Coming in.
Banks have already given up have already provided tens of millions of dollars for securitization on that. So, but I think the ball's in really the city court for that. I think almost everything that could be done outside of city government has been done. Unless anybody has a comment on that one.
Hi, I have a question for Andy. Where are you in terms of the supply and demand with the bank? And what kinds of marketing strategies do you use, or are there other entities? You said you've been in existence for 2 years now?
The Green Bank, the CPACE program has been in existence for 2 years. The Green Bank is closing in on 4 in terms of the statutory. So we play a different variety of roles. For performance contracting, we're really part of the administration and development of the program with Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We're a program administrator. For other programs, we are, can be a little more hands-off in terms of playing that active role, or back off over time to hand that administrative role to somebody else. So it varies. I mean, it's definitely very heavily weighted towards the early stage programs, where we've got to get the word out and train people and reach out to the stakeholders and develop the initiatives and strategies and all. But over time, and I think we're even seeing interest in the CPACE program to kind of get out of the way, be limited to what your statutory authority is and let the banks handle it, finance the warehouse, finance the securitization, and to reduce our involvement. And that may happen over time as it becomes fully operational.
And if I remember correctly in the history with Connecticut, you set this up that each municipality had to sort of opt into participation in this program one by one. I think you're over 90 now, but it's...
Yeah, we've got over 90% of the commercial industrial market. Those is in a town that is opted into CPACE. So, I think about 100 towns have opted in, and that covers 90% of the C&I market, the small towns.
Because the local municipality is the one that's ultimately going to build, they either need to have a mechanism to do that or delegate that authority to some other party. So ultimately, the person levying the property tax has to be opting into this before it can really go anywhere. So we'll do one more question.
SEPI has been like a really successful model, we find. And I guess, what would you suggest for an entity like the Green Bank that, while we support it, has been trying to back into a model for the last few years and really hasn't found what it's going to be? Should they just take half of what they're doing and invest it in customer side education? Because that's the real barrier.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the earlier question, that's a critical piece, and you've got to be willing to spend the money on that. We've spent a fair amount of money on marketing and support and outreach and those services that ideally, going forward, we can be just a bank and not do that. And the performance contracting piece, we'd like to get it automated to where someone just calls us and we issue bond or invite to bid, whatever it is. But we don't need to be out pounding the pavement to explain the concept to people. Some of our more resi programs or PV programs are almost entirely administered by the contractors themselves. They go sell the work, bring it to us, and we're just processing transactions behind the scenes. But you've really got to be willing to invest that piece to get it up and running and get to that stage.
The municipalities sell to students.
So the CPACE, they do. I think it's something they can offer to their commercial customers that they're trying to, make sure they stay in town. There's, programs like Solarize and all they can offer to the residential customers, and we can bring in performance contracting for them to do to their own municipalities. I think, our goal is to have a spectrum of services we can bring in that as well.
And And once the program's live, you can get a lot of stakeholders. I spoke to the heads of the Green Homes Initiative out on Long Island, that's town of Babylon. They had a fairly unique financing circumstance to allow them to do this. But what they found was, once they created the program, put it in place, the contractors, the home builders, were the ones out there pushing this, because obviously it meant more business for them. And there was still this sort of, again, this auditing and underwriting and a good third-party perspective and verification of anything got done, but they themselves became the advocate for the program.
I mean, like in New York State, EIC or Energize New York, they're out there all the time, going to municipalities all over the state, marketing the program, getting engineers, as part of their, and the contractors, so that they know that this program is there to finance these projects.
Because ultimately, the more capital that's out there, the more construction that's going to get done. So a lot of people have a stake in seeing that move forward.
Absolutely.
Like that's what their role is to administer this program, and part of that is to let people know it exists.
Yeah,
right.
And that's the most important thing is communication.
Absolutely, and I totally agree. And you have to spend the money to market it, to sell it. Otherwise, well, even if it's free money on the table, they're not going to come get it.
Right. Yeah, I think we're actually at perfect timing. So thank you, everybody, for coming. This was really I mean, Andrea, have any closing remarks? Or
You want to tell us something, Joe?
okay.
Finish the food.
Working with
Yes.
Agrion.